This is Elias Mercer, broadcasting from coordinates you will never know, speaking to whoever still remembers what it felt like to be American. Tonight marks 3 years and 7 months since the Republic died. Not in some grand battle or foreign invasion, but in 72 hours of bureaucratic betrayal that carved our nation into bleeding pieces. The 28th election should have been routine. Close margins, heated rhetoric, the usual promises about healing and unity. Instead, it became the funeral pyre of everything our founders built. When 17 states refused to certify results they deemed fraudulent, and 11 others declared those same results sacred, the center didn't just fail to hold, it evaporated like morning mist under a blowtorch. I was hosting Morning Drive on WKXT Cleveland when the first domino fell. Tuesday, November 7th, 2028. The governor of Texas held a press conference at dawn, announcing that his state would no longer recognize federal authority over election disputes. Within 6 hours, 12 more governors had made similar declarations. By evening, the Attorney General had declared those governors in rebellion. By midnight, 3 state National Guard units had split along political lines, with some soldiers following federal orders, while others remained loyal to their state commanders. The speed of collapse defied every expert prediction. Political scientists had warned about polarization for decades, but they spoke of gradual deterioration, institutional decay measured in election cycles. None anticipated how quickly the bones of government would snap once real pressure was applied. The Constitution, that document we'd treated as sacred scripture, turned out to be remarkably fragile when half the country decided it no longer applied to them. Samuel Draven was our chief engineer then, a quiet man who'd survived Korea and understood that civilizations could disappear overnight. While I was still broadcasting traffic reports and weather updates, Samuel was rigging emergency equipment in our basement, preparing for the moment when normal would cease to exist. He never explained his urgency, just muttered about how the smell in the air reminded him of Seoul in '52, right before the Chinese crossed the Yalu. The first federal raids began on Thursday morning. Not arrests, seizures. Corporate security firms with hastily issued federal contracts rolled up to media outlets in unmarked vans, confiscating broadcast equipment under emergency provisions nobody had bothered to read. They called it protecting critical infrastructure from domestic terrorists. The real target was information itself, specifically any information that contradicted official narratives about election integrity and national unity. Marcus Rourke called my show that morning. He was a federal marshal then, 30-year veteran with a voice like gravel and a conscience that wouldn't let him sleep. He'd been ordered to participate in raids against broadcast facilities suspected of spreading disinformation. When he realized disinformation meant any news that made federal authorities uncomfortable, he started making anonymous phone calls to warn stations before the vans arrived. His first call came to us because we'd been reporting on the National Guard splits, information the federal government wanted buried. The corporate militias reached our building at 2 in the afternoon. Samuel and I were broadcasting from the 14th floor when we heard boots on the stairwell, systematic and inevitable as cancer. Samuel grabbed the emergency kit he'd prepared, portable radio gear, batteries, enough supplies for a week in hell. We made it to the service elevator while they were still smashing equipment on the floors below. Cleveland was already transforming as we drove north toward Lake Erie. Military checkpoints appeared like mushrooms after rain, manned by soldiers who couldn't explain which authority they represented or what their orders actually were. Some checked identification and waved civilians through. Others detained anyone whose paperwork showed residence in the wrong zip codes. The randomness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. In the space of 3 days, basic civil rights had become a lottery based on which soldier you encountered and what mood he was in. Samuel's destination lay hidden in the forests east of the city, an abandoned Cold War communications bunker that the government had forgotten when the Soviet Union collapsed. He discovered it in the 80s and spent decades converting it into something between a broadcast facility and a tomb. 3 levels underground, powered by solar arrays and diesel generators, equipped with transmitters that could reach across the continent if atmospheric conditions cooperated. Samuel had been preparing for the end of the world since before I was born, and his paranoia had finally been vindicated. The bunker became our refuge and our prison. Above ground, America was dismantling itself with surgical precision. Federal forces controlled major cities and interstate highways. State militias held rural counties and smaller towns. Between them, a growing no-man's land where authority meant whatever the strongest group decided it meant on any given day. Communication networks fragmented along political lines. Internet traffic was monitored and filtered. Television broadcasts became pure propaganda, indistinguishable from wartime radio in occupied territories. But underground networks persisted. Ham radio operators, former military communications specialists, journalists who'd gone dark rather than submit to federal oversight. Samuel had been building these connections for years, a web of voices that official channels couldn't silence or control. Through this network, we began receiving reports that painted a picture of systematic national suicide. Marcus Rourke's voice reached us through encrypted channels, describing the first armed confrontation between federal forces and state militias in Virginia. 2 units that had served together in Afghanistan found themselves aiming weapons at former brothers in arms over a courthouse that neither side really wanted to control. The shooting lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, 11 Americans were dead, and the concept of United States military unity had died with them. The psychological warfare began immediately. Both sides claimed the other had fired first, had committed atrocities, had betrayed sacred oaths to the Constitution. Truth became the first casualty, not of war, but of political necessity. Every incident was filtered through competing narratives until facts became meaningless, and reality was whatever version served your faction's interests. My sister Rachel lived in Detroit with her husband and twin daughters. I lost contact with them during the 3rd week, when Michigan's governor declared a state of emergency and began restricting movement between counties. My last conversation with Rachel was brief and terrifying. She described National Guard units patrolling their neighborhood, conducting house-to-house searches for weapons and subversive materials. Her voice carried a hollow quality I'd never heard before, the sound of someone watching their world dissolve in real time. The searches weren't really about weapons. They were about compliance, about demonstrating that privacy and constitutional protections were luxuries the new reality couldn't afford. Families that cooperated were left alone. Those who questioned the authority or legality of the searches found themselves on lists that determined everything from employment opportunities to access to medical care. Food distribution became weaponized within the first month. Federal territories received supplies through FEMA and corporate partnerships. State alliance regions organized their own networks, often excluding communities suspected of federal sympathies. The hunger didn't discriminate based on political affiliation, but the relief efforts certainly did. Starvation became a tool of political control, more effective than bullets and infinitely more deniable. Samuel's network provided fragments of the larger picture. Power grids failed in strategic patterns, always attributed to maintenance issues or cyber attacks by unnamed foreign actors. Banking systems experienced selective outages that seemed to correlate with the political affiliations of affected regions. Transportation networks ground to a halt as different authorities issued conflicting regulations and safety requirements. The genius of the collapse was its bureaucratic nature. No dramatic declarations of war, no mass mobilizations, just the steady application of administrative pressure until normal life became impossible. Citizens woke up each morning to discover new restrictions, new requirements, new impossibilities that hadn't existed the day before. The Constitution was never officially suspended. It simply became irrelevant as competing authorities issued contradictory interpretations of the same founding documents. Winter arrived early that year, or perhaps it just felt that way as the nation's infrastructure buckled under political strain. Heating fuel became scarce in regions controlled by hostile factions. Medical supplies were redirected to politically reliable areas. Emergency services responded selectively, based on the perceived loyalty of requesting communities. Tonight, 3 years later, I broadcast to the fragments of a country that once spanned a continent. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the divided states, about the internal borders that carved neighbors into enemies, about the checkpoints where Americans need papers to travel through their own homeland. But tonight, remember this. The United States of America didn't fall to foreign enemies or natural disasters. She committed suicide, one bureaucratic decision at a time, because we forgot that our differences were supposed to make us stronger, not tear us apart. This is Elias Mercer, keeping the signal alive in the darkness. Until tomorrow night, remember what we used to be. This is Elias Mercer, transmitting from the underground to those still listening in what we once called the United States. Tonight I speak to you about the cartographers of our dissolution, the men who drew new borders across a continent that had known none for 2 centuries. The maps they created weren't marked with ink, but with razor wire and blood, transforming a nation into a collection of armed camps masquerading as sovereign territories. By the spring of '29, 3 primary factions had emerged from the chaos. The federal coalition maintained control of Washington, major metropolitan areas, and the industrial corridors of the Northeast and West Coast. Their authority rested on corporate partnerships, urban populations dependent on centralized services, and the remnants of federal agencies that still believed in institutional continuity. They controlled the money, the technology, and the narrative that reached international audiences. The State Alliance claimed the agricultural heartland, the energy-producing regions, and vast stretches of rural territory where federal presence had always been minimal. Governors who had rejected federal election oversight became presidents of their own republics, backed by National Guard units that had chosen state loyalty over federal oaths. They controlled the food, the fuel, and the cultural identity that half the continent still considered authentically American. Between these opposing forces lay the free territories, regions that had rejected both federal and state authority in favor of local control. These areas became laboratories for every political experiment humanity had ever attempted, from voluntary communes to military dictatorships, from religious theocracies to anarchist collectives. They controlled nothing but geography, and that control proved more fragile than morning frost. Jonah Callahan commanded one such territory, a county in southeastern Ohio that had declared independence from all higher authorities. He'd been sheriff there for 16 years before the collapse, respected by constituents who valued his practical approach to law enforcement. When state and federal officials began issuing contradictory orders about election security, gun confiscation, and emergency powers, Callahan made the decision that defined his legacy. He chose his neighbors over his government. The transformation from sheriff to warlord happened gradually, almost naturally. When supply convoys stopped arriving due to jurisdictional disputes, Callahan organized local distribution networks. When banking systems became unreliable, he established alternative currency based on labor and goods. When courts closed due to conflicting legal authorities, he implemented community justice based on local customs and practical necessity. By winter, he was running a functioning microstate with 30,000 inhabitants who looked to him for everything from conflict resolution to trade negotiations. Callahan's territory survived because it provided something both major factions needed: agricultural surplus and manufacturing capacity. He negotiated agreements with federal coalition cities hungry for food and state alliance regions requiring manufactured goods. His neutrality was profitable, but neutrality in civil conflict is always temporary. Both sides viewed independent territories as potential allies or inevitable threats, never as permanent fixtures. The borders between these territories became the defining feature of post-collapse America. Not the clean lines drawn on colonial maps, but messy, contested zones where authority changed based on time of day and the political affiliations of local commanders. Interstate highways that had once connected a continent now terminated at checkpoints where Americans needed documentation to prove their right to exist in their own country. Thomas Keene documented this transformation with the methodical precision of a man recording the end of the world. He'd served 12 years in Congress before the collapse, representing a district that now found itself split between federal coalition and state alliance control. His constituents had become refugees in their own neighborhoods, subject to different laws depending on which side of newly drawn boundaries they occupied. Keene traveled these borders obsessively, interviewing families separated by political geography, documenting the bureaucratic mechanisms that had replaced constitutional governance. He described checkpoints where former neighbors interrogated each other about political affiliations, where children learned to recognize the uniforms that determined whether they were citizens or suspects. His reports painted a portrait of administrative madness, where the same person could be a law-abiding citizen on one side of a street and a potential terrorist on the other. The most haunting aspect of Keene's documentation was its emphasis on normalcy. The guards at checkpoints were polite, professional, apologetic about the inconvenience. The forms required for travel were comprehensive but reasonable. The restrictions on movement were temporary measures necessitated by ongoing security concerns. The bureaucracy of oppression wrapped itself in familiar language and institutional procedures, making tyranny feel like nothing more than enhanced public safety. Daniel Whitford experienced this bureaucratic nightmare from the inside. He'd spent 15 years with FEMA, coordinating disaster response across multiple states, building relationships with local officials, and understanding how federal aid actually reached communities in crisis. When the collapse began, he found himself caught between competing authorities, each claiming legitimate jurisdiction over emergency resources. Whitford's final assignment involved delivering medical supplies to hospitals in disputed territories. What should have been routine logistics became a journey through political purgatory. Federal supervisors ordered him to prioritize coalition-controlled facilities. State officials threatened prosecution if he didn't distribute supplies based on local political considerations. Local authorities demanded tribute payments for safe passage through their jurisdictions. The medical supplies never reached their destinations. Whitford abandoned his federal credentials after witnessing bureaucratic territorialism condemn patients to suffer for political reasons. He became a refugee himself, carrying nothing but detailed knowledge of how institutional failure translated into human misery. His accounts described hospitals closing due to jurisdictional disputes over funding, patients dying because emergency services couldn't cross political boundaries, medical professionals fleeing regions where their licenses weren't recognized by new authorities. The systematic breakdown of supply chains represented perhaps the most devastating aspect of territorial division. Products manufactured in federal coalition territories couldn't reach state alliance markets due to trade restrictions. Agricultural goods from rural regions were banned from urban areas for food safety reasons that coincidentally aligned with political boundaries. Energy resources became weapons, with power plants shutting off electricity to hostile territories and refineries restricting fuel deliveries to politically unreliable regions. Winter proved the ultimate test of these new arrangements. Heating fuel shortages in northern cities led to mass evacuations that resembled refugee movements more than seasonal migration. Food distribution networks collapsed as competing authorities imposed contradictory safety regulations and inspection requirements. Emergency shelters became political battlegrounds where admission depended on documentation proving allegiance to local authorities. Samuel and I monitored these developments through our underground network, collecting reports that painted an increasingly dire picture of national disintegration. Each faction claimed to represent legitimate government while denying legitimacy to their opponents. Federal coalition leaders spoke of restoring constitutional order while implementing martial law provisions that suspended constitutional protections. State alliance governors promised local self-determination while establishing authoritarian control over dissenting communities. The propaganda war between factions created alternate realities that never intersected. Federal coalition broadcasts described state militias as terrorist organizations funded by foreign enemies. State alliance media portrayed federal agents as occupation forces implementing globalist agendas. Independent territories were either heroic freedom fighters or dangerous anarchists, depending on which narrative served immediate political needs. Communication between territories became increasingly restricted and monitored. Internet traffic was filtered through faction-controlled servers. Mail service operated only within political boundaries. Phone systems were partitioned along jurisdictional lines. Family members separated by the new borders lost contact, not through dramatic severing of ties, but through the gradual strangulation of communication infrastructure. My own experience reflected this systematic isolation. Attempts to contact my sister in Detroit were blocked by federal communication restrictions implemented for national security reasons. State alliance territories had established their own phone networks that didn't connect to federal systems. Independent territories maintained local communication, but lacked the infrastructure to reach beyond their boundaries. The economic consequences of territorial division exceeded even pessimistic projections. Currency became regionalized as different authorities issued their own scrip and refused to accept competing forms of payment. Banking systems fragmented along political lines, making commerce between territories nearly impossible. Credit and debt relationships that had spanned the continent became meaningless when counterparties existed in hostile jurisdictions. International observers compared the situation to the dissolution of Yugoslavia, but the comparison understated the complexity. America's collapse involved the world's largest economy, most sophisticated military, and most integrated infrastructure network. The ripple effects touched every continent as global supply chains dependent on American production and consumption collapsed, along with domestic political unity. Foreign governments initially attempted neutrality, maintaining diplomatic relations with all factions while avoiding recognition of territorial claims. This position became untenable as each faction demanded exclusive legitimacy and threatened retaliation against nations that acknowledged their opponents. International isolation compounded domestic problems, cutting off technological cooperation, financial systems, and trade relationships that American prosperity had always assumed. The psychological impact of territorial division proved as devastating as economic consequences. Americans who had grown up assuming continental mobility discovered they were prisoners of geography and politics. Professional networks that had spanned states became meaningless when licensing authorities refused to recognize credentials from hostile territories. Educational institutions lost accreditation when political boundaries cut them off from regional accrediting bodies. Tonight, from this underground bunker in what was once Ohio, I broadcast to fragments of audience scattered across territories that barely acknowledge each other's existence. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the no man's land between these territories, about the communities that tried to remain neutral and learned that neutrality is considered treason by all sides. But remember this, the borders that divide us aren't natural features or ancient boundaries. They're fresh wounds carved by political ambition across the body of a nation that once believed itself indivisible. This is Elias Mercer, speaking to whatever remains of America, keeping the signal alive in the darkness between territories. This is Elias Mercer, broadcasting from beneath the ruins of what we once called civilization. Tonight I speak of the spaces between territories, the buffer zones where America bleeds out slowly in abandoned towns and forgotten highways. These are the places that both sides claim but neither controls, where the absence of authority has become its own form of governance, harsh and final as winter frost. The no man's land emerged naturally from the territorial divisions, like infections spreading through wounded tissue. Communities that found themselves geographically isolated from their chosen faction discovered that political loyalty meant nothing without logistical support. Towns that straddled territorial boundaries became ghost settlements when residents fled, rather than choose sides. Infrastructure abandoned by retreating authorities deteriorated rapidly without maintenance, creating expanding zones of mechanical death. Caleb Hensley knew these territories intimately, having walked through them for 2 years as a deserter from the National Guard. He'd been stationed at Fort Knox when Kentucky split along county lines, with eastern regions joining the state alliance, while western counties remained nominally federal. His unit received orders to establish control over disputed territories, which translated into armed patrols through communities where former neighbors viewed soldiers as occupying forces, regardless of their political allegiances. Hensley's breaking point came during a routine patrol through a farming community that had declared neutrality. Federal authorities considered neutrality a form of resistance, while state alliance commanders viewed it as potential collaboration with the enemy. Both sides conducted regular sweeps through neutral territories, searching for evidence of support provided to their opponents. The searches were thorough, destructive, and ultimately pointless, since neutrality itself was the crime being investigated. The farming community had survived the first year of collapse by maintaining strict political silence, trading with whoever offered fair terms, while avoiding statements that might be construed as factional support. Their pragmatic neutrality worked until competing authorities decided that neutrality enabled their enemies. Federal forces confiscated grain supplies suspected of feeding state alliance militias. State patrols destroyed equipment allegedly provided by federal coalition sympathizers. Both sides left the farmers with nothing but accusations of treason. Hensley watched his unit participate in this systematic destruction of neutrality, implementing orders that criminalized the basic human instinct for survival. When commanded to arrest farmers for possessing federal coalition currency found during searches, he faced the choice that defined his remaining life: follow orders that violated every moral principle he'd ever held, or abandon the structure that had given his existence meaning since adolescence. He chose desertion, walking away from his unit during a nighttime patrol and disappearing into territories that existed beyond the reach of organized authority. The decision transformed him from soldier to refugee, from enforcer of order to victim of the chaos he'd helped create. His knowledge of military procedures and territorial boundaries made him valuable to civilian groups trying to navigate between competing authorities. But that same knowledge marked him as a traitor deserving execution if captured by either side. The refugees Hensley guided through no man's land came from every background imaginable, united only by their displacement from the new political geography. Families separated by territorial boundaries, professionals whose careers had vanished with institutional collapse, elderly people abandoned when care facilities closed due to jurisdictional disputes. They moved like medieval pilgrims through a landscape that had reverted to pre-industrial conditions, carrying possessions that defined their former lives, and hoping to reach territories that might accept them. Navigation through disputed zones required knowledge that no civilian possessed naturally. Military patrol schedules, factional territorial claims, seasonal variations in enforcement priorities, local commanders with personal vendettas against specific refugee populations. Hensley accumulated this information through networks of other deserters, civilian scouts, and traders who profited from the chaos by selling safe passage through their territories. Owen Riker represented the tragedy of communities that tried to maintain civilization in the face of systematic abandonment. He'd been mayor of a town straddling the border between federal coalition and state alliance territories, elected on promises of pragmatic governance and fiscal responsibility. His constituents included federal employees, state contractors, and independent business owners who had coexisted peacefully for generations despite political differences. The collapse forced Riker to navigate impossible choices that would have challenged Solomon himself. Federal authorities demanded that he implement coalition policies and exclude state alliance sympathizers from municipal services. State officials threatened economic sanctions unless he recognized their territorial claims and expelled federal employees. Both sides offered protection contingent on exclusive loyalty that would have required betraying half his constituents. Riker attempted neutrality by providing services to all residents regardless of their political affiliations, maintaining infrastructure that served both territories, and refusing to implement policies that discriminated based on factional loyalty. His pragmatic approach worked briefly until both sides concluded that neutrality was impossible, and neutrality itself constituted opposition to their legitimate authority. The end came during a winter storm that knocked out power across the region. Federal coalition authorities offered restoration services contingent on Riker's public endorsement of their territorial claims. State alliance officials promised alternative power sources if he expelled federal employees and recognized state sovereignty. Both offers required him to choose between constituencies he'd sworn to serve equally. Riker chose his principles over political expedience, maintaining neutrality even as his town froze in darkness. Federal forces cut the community off from coalition power grids. State militias blocked fuel deliveries and prevented repair crews from entering the area. Within weeks, the population had fled to territories that offered basic services in exchange for political compliance, leaving Riker alone in a ghost town that had become a monument to the impossibility of neutrality in civil conflict. Richard Holloway documented the transformation of these abandoned communities with the methodical precision of an archaeologist studying vanished civilizations. He'd spent 20 years as a war correspondent covering conflicts in distant countries, never imagining he'd apply those skills to the dissolution of his homeland. His reports described the infrastructure decay that followed political abandonment, the way civilization retreated from disputed territories like tide leaving behind barren sand. Holloway's documentation revealed patterns that repeated across thousands of communities. Initial population flight as residents sought territories that offered basic services and physical security. Infrastructure failure as maintenance systems designed for larger populations became economically unsustainable. Environmental degradation as industrial facilities were abandoned without proper shutdown procedures. Criminal exploitation as organized gangs filled the vacuum left by legitimate authority. The abandoned territories became laboratories for studying societal collapse in real time. Industrial facilities designed to operate continuously suffered catastrophic failures when suddenly shut down without proper procedures. Chemical plants leaked toxins into groundwater supplies. Nuclear power stations went into emergency shutdown modes that required constant monitoring unavailable in disputed territories. The environmental consequences would affect the continent for decades, but addressing them required cooperation between factions that viewed environmental protection as secondary to military advantage. Transportation networks designed for continental integration became obstacles to territorial division. Interstate highways that crossed multiple jurisdictions required maintenance agreements between hostile authorities. Rail networks designed for efficient freight movement couldn't operate when different territories implemented incompatible regulations. Aviation systems collapsed when air traffic control centers were abandoned due to jurisdictional disputes between factional authorities. Samuel monitored these developments through technical networks that revealed the mechanical reality behind political abstractions. Power grids designed for regional integration began failing when territorial authorities refused to coordinate maintenance schedules. Communication systems built on interconnected infrastructure couldn't function when different territories implemented incompatible security protocols. Water treatment facilities serving multiple jurisdictions shut down, rather than navigate conflicting regulatory requirements imposed by factional authorities. The psychological impact of infrastructure collapse often exceeded immediate physical hardships. Americans had grown up assuming that electricity, clean water, and communication networks were natural features of existence, rather than complex systems requiring constant maintenance and cooperation. The sudden absence of these services created existential anxiety that manifested in depression, violence, and desperate migration toward territories that still maintained basic civilization. Medical care in disputed territories became a matter of individual resourcefulness rather than systemic provision. Hospitals closed when staffing became impossible due to credential recognition disputes between factional authorities. Pharmacies ran out of supplies when distribution networks collapsed along political boundaries. Emergency services ceased operations when jurisdictional confusion made coordination impossible, and liability concerns made intervention legally dangerous. Educational systems simply vanished from no man's land territories. Schools closed when teachers fled to areas offering stable employment and physical security. Libraries were abandoned when municipalities could no longer fund maintenance. Universities that had served regional populations for generations shut down when accreditation bodies fragmented along political lines and student populations dispersed to territories that recognized their degrees. The criminal exploitation of abandoned territories developed with entrepreneurial efficiency. Organized groups moved into areas where legitimate authority had withdrawn, establishing protection rackets, drug production facilities, and human trafficking networks that served customers across territorial boundaries. These criminal enterprises often provided more reliable services than legitimate authorities, creating economic incentives that further undermined attempts to restore governmental control. Foreign observers compared the situation to failed states in distant regions, but the comparison understated the unique horror of watching advanced civilization collapse in real time. The United States had possessed the most sophisticated infrastructure network in human history, and its dissolution created cascading failures that affected global systems dependent on American technological leadership and economic stability. Tonight, broadcasting from bunkers hidden in territories that exist between the maps drawn by competing authorities, I speak to audiences scattered across a continent where basic services have become political privileges rather than assumed rights. Tomorrow I'll tell you about the human cost of this collapse, about the psychological casualties of a conflict that has made strangers of neighbors and enemies of family members. But remember this, the no man's land between territories isn't empty space waiting for political resolution. It's filled with the ghosts of communities that believed neutrality was possible, infrastructure that assumed cooperation was permanent, and dreams that died when America chose division over unity. This is Elias Mercer, keeping the signal alive in the spaces between territories, speaking to whatever remains of our shared humanity in the ruins of our shared country. This is Elias Mercer, transmitting from the underground networks that connect the fragments of what we once called home. Tonight I speak of costs that cannot be calculated in currency or territory, casualties that leave no bodies but destroy souls just as thoroughly as bullets destroy flesh. The price of our division extends beyond economics and politics into the fundamental architecture of human identity, dismantling the psychological foundations that made us recognizable to ourselves. Nathaniel Burke spent his career treating trauma in veterans returning from foreign wars, helping soldiers process the psychological damage inflicted by combat in distant lands. When the territories formed and conflict began consuming the continent, he discovered that civil war created wounds that conventional therapy couldn't address. His patients weren't struggling with memories of fighting strangers in foreign countries. They were trying to process the experience of aiming weapons at neighbors, of viewing former friends as existential threats, of living in constant fear that their own family members might betray them to hostile authorities. Burke's practice relocated 3 times as territorial boundaries shifted and his credentials were recognized or rejected by changing authorities. Each move cost him patients who couldn't cross political boundaries to continue treatment, creating therapeutic abandonment that compounded their existing trauma. He documented cases that challenged every assumption about human resilience and recovery. Patients whose identity had been so thoroughly shattered by civil conflict that they could no longer remember who they had been before the territories formed. The most devastating cases involved families divided by political geography, parents separated from adult children by borders that hadn't existed when those children were born. Burke treated mothers who received letters from sons living in hostile territories, letters that had to be smuggled across boundaries like contraband because official mail service between territories had been suspended for security reasons. The cognitive dissonance of loving someone officially classified as an enemy created psychological fragmentation that manifested in severe depression, anxiety disorders, and complete withdrawal from social interaction. Professional identity collapsed along with national unity. Doctors whose licenses weren't recognized in new territories found themselves legally prohibited from practicing medicine despite unchanged skills and knowledge. Teachers discovered that their credentials were worthless in regions controlled by authorities who rejected their former training as politically contaminated. Engineers who had designed infrastructure projects spanning multiple states couldn't maintain or repair their own work when territorial boundaries made travel impossible. Aaron Maddox exemplified this professional displacement, having spent 15 years conducting census operations that required travel across county and state boundaries that no longer existed in any meaningful form. His work had involved building comprehensive demographic profiles of regional populations, tracking migration patterns, and documenting economic trends that required data collection from areas now controlled by hostile authorities. Maddox's final census project attempted to document population changes resulting from territorial formation, a task that required cooperation between factional authorities who viewed demographic information as military intelligence. Federal coalition territories refused to share population data that might reveal strategic vulnerabilities. State alliance regions classified census information as state secrets that couldn't be disclosed to federal researchers. Independent territories lacked the administrative capacity to conduct systematic data collection and viewed outside researchers as potential spies. The failure to complete census operations created cascading effects throughout systems that depended on population data for resource allocation, infrastructure planning, and emergency response coordination. Federal disaster relief couldn't be properly allocated without accurate population counts. State agricultural planning couldn't account for demographic changes. Medical supply distribution operated on outdated assumptions about population density and geographic distribution. Maddox's attempts to continue census work as an independent researcher led to detention by territorial authorities who suspected him of espionage. His maps and demographic data were confiscated as potential military intelligence. His computer files were analyzed for evidence of coordination with enemy authorities. His professional contacts were investigated as possible intelligence networks. The systematic criminalization of data collection transformed neutral research into treasonous activity subject to punishment by whatever authority happened to control his location. Benjamin Carter represented the emergence of feudal economics in regions where centralized authority had collapsed entirely. He'd operated a small manufacturing business, producing agricultural equipment for farms across 3 states, maintaining supply chains and customer relationships that crossed what became hostile territorial boundaries. His business model assumed continental economic integration, reliable transportation networks, and legal frameworks that protected commerce across state lines. Territorial formation destroyed these assumptions overnight. Customers in state alliance territories couldn't purchase equipment manufactured in federal coalition regions due to trade restrictions implemented for national security reasons. Transportation companies refused to make deliveries across territorial boundaries because insurance companies wouldn't cover losses in disputed areas. Banking systems couldn't process payments between territories because financial regulations were incompatible and regulatory authorities didn't recognize each other's jurisdiction. Carter's business adapted by fragmenting along territorial lines, establishing separate operations in different regions to serve local markets isolated from broader economic networks. This localization required duplicating manufacturing facilities, supply chains, and administrative systems that had previously benefited from economies of scale. The economic efficiency that had characterized American capitalism disappeared as territorial boundaries forced businesses to operate in isolated markets too small to support sophisticated production methods. The psychological cost of economic fragmentation extended beyond business owners to workers whose careers had assumed national labor markets and professional mobility. Skilled technicians discovered that their expertise was trapped within territorial boundaries, valuable only in regions where they happened to live when borders solidified. Professional networks that had spanned the continent were severed by communication restrictions and travel limitations that made collaboration across territories impossible. Vincent Harlow documented these economic transformations while serving communities that had lost connection to broader religious institutions divided by territorial boundaries. He'd spent 20 years building interfaith networks that promoted cooperation between different religious traditions, work that assumed religious freedom and institutional continuity across regional boundaries. The territorial formation destroyed these networks by making travel impossible and classifying religious cooperation as potential political collaboration. Harlow's congregation included members who lived in territories controlled by different authorities, families whose worship had been criminalized by factional governments that viewed religious diversity as political subversion. Federal coalition territories promoted secular governance that viewed traditional religious practice as potentially seditious. State alliance regions enforced religious conformity that excluded denominations considered politically unreliable. Independent territories often fell under the control of religious extremists who persecuted believers whose practices didn't align with local orthodoxy. The fragmentation of religious institutions created spiritual isolation that compounded other psychological trauma resulting from territorial division. Believers who had found meaning through participation in national religious networks discovered that their faith communities no longer existed in any recognizable form. Religious holidays became politically charged expressions of territorial loyalty rather than spiritual observances that transcended political boundaries. Marriage and family relationships suffered particularly devastating damage from territorial division. Couples separated by borders that hadn't existed when they married found themselves subject to different legal systems that didn't recognize marriages performed in hostile territories. Divorce proceedings became impossible when spouses lived under different authorities that refused to coordinate legal processes. Child custody arrangements collapsed when territorial boundaries made enforcement impossible and travel restrictions prevented visitation. My own family exemplified these separations, with my sister Rachel and her family trapped in Detroit when Michigan split along political lines and travel between territories became restricted. Our last communication occurred through smuggling networks that charged substantial fees for delivering letters across territorial boundaries. The letters took weeks to reach their destinations and arrived heavily censored by authorities who viewed personal correspondence as potential intelligence communication. The psychological cost of these separations extended beyond immediate family relationships to broader social networks that had provided meaning and identity. Professional associations dissolved when members couldn't travel to meetings or maintain communication across territorial boundaries. Social organizations fragmented along political lines as members were forced to choose between personal relationships and political survival. Educational institutions lost alumni networks that had spanned generations as territorial boundaries made reunification impossible. Cultural production ceased in many regions as artists, writers, and musicians lost access to national audiences and distribution networks. Local cultural scenes couldn't support professional creative work in territories with populations too small to sustain sophisticated artistic production. National cultural institutions like museums, theaters, and publishing companies either closed or became propaganda organs, serving territorial authorities rather than broader artistic traditions. The destruction of shared cultural references accelerated social fragmentation as different territories developed distinct narratives about current events, historical interpretation, and future possibilities. News media became purely local as national networks couldn't operate across territorial boundaries, and international media was banned as foreign propaganda. Educational curricula diverged as different authorities implemented incompatible standards and ideological requirements that criminalized teaching materials developed in hostile territories. Language itself began fragmenting as different territories developed distinct vocabularies for political concepts, economic arrangements, and social relationships. Terms that had shared meanings across the continent became politically charged expressions that identified speakers as belonging to specific territorial allegiances. Communication across boundaries required constant translation not just of words, but of entire conceptual frameworks that had diverged during years of isolation. Tonight, from this bunker buried beneath territories that exist only in the spaces between official maps, I broadcast to audiences whose very ability to understand these words represents resistance against the forces tearing apart our shared language and culture. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the final signals, about the last attempts to hold our scattered fragments together before the darkness closes completely. But remember this, the price of division isn't measured in dollars or territory, but in the destruction of everything that made us human together rather than human alone. This is Elias Mercer, keeping alive the words we shared before we forgot how to speak to each other, transmitting hope into the silence between our broken hearts. This is Elias Mercer, broadcasting what may be my final transmission from coordinates that federal triangulation equipment has been narrowing for the past 72 hours. Tonight I speak to you not as a voice in the darkness, but as a witness preparing to join the silence, adding my testimony to the archive of a nation that chose to destroy itself rather than confront the mirror of its own contradictions. The surveillance net has been tightening for months, ever since Isaac Garrison made contact with our network carrying intelligence that changed everything we thought we understood about this conflict. Garrison spent 30 years with the Central Intelligence Agency, analyzing foreign threats and political instability in distant nations. His expertise in recognizing the patterns of societal collapse had been directed outward until the territories formed, and he realized he was witnessing textbook destabilization operations being conducted against his own country. Garrison's analysis revealed coordination that neither major faction wanted acknowledged. Foreign intelligence services had been amplifying existing American divisions through social media manipulation, financial support for extremist groups, and strategic information warfare designed to prevent reconciliation between opposing sides. The techniques were identical to operations he'd observed in Yugoslavia, Syria, and Libya, adapted for American political culture and implemented with surgical precision. The foreign intervention wasn't designed to support any particular faction, but to ensure the conflict remained irreconcilable. When federal coalition forces gained tactical advantages, weapons shipments appeared in state alliance territories. When state militias achieved strategic victories, federal authorities received intelligence that enabled devastating counterstrikes. The goal was perpetual conflict that would permanently fragment American power and eliminate the United States as a coherent geopolitical entity. Garrison's evidence included intercepted communications, financial records, and operational documents that proved foreign coordination of domestic extremist groups across factional boundaries. The materials demonstrated that supposed grassroots movements on both sides were receiving direction and funding from intelligence services that viewed American Civil War as the optimal outcome for global power realignment. The revelation explained why peace negotiations consistently failed and why moderate voices were systematically marginalized by both factions. The intelligence community's response to Garrison's revelations was swift and predictable. He was declared a traitor by federal authorities who claimed his evidence was fabricated propaganda designed to undermine national security operations. State alliance leaders dismissed his warnings as federal disinformation intended to justify increased surveillance powers. Both sides had invested too much in their narratives of righteous struggle to acknowledge that they were being manipulated by forces that viewed their conflict as entertainment and opportunity. Garrison went underground rather than face prosecution by authorities who preferred convenient lies to inconvenient truths. His intelligence reached our network through channels that bypassed official communication systems monitored by factional authorities and foreign intelligence services. The information painted a picture of national suicide orchestrated by enemies who understood American psychology better than Americans understood themselves. Lucas Trent represented the final failure of institutional solutions to manufactured crises. He'd spent his career mediating international disputes, finding common ground between parties whose differences seemed irreconcilable. When appointed to lead peace negotiations between American factions, he assumed his experience with foreign conflicts would translate to domestic reconciliation efforts. Trent's negotiations failed because both sides had been conditioned to view compromise as betrayal and reconciliation as surrender. Federal coalition representatives demanded unconditional recognition of federal supremacy and the dissolution of state militias. State alliance delegates insisted on permanent autonomy and the withdrawal withdrawal of federal forces from their territories. Neither side was willing to acknowledge legitimacy in their opponents' positions, because doing so would undermine the ideological purity that justified their own existence. The peace talks collapsed when evidence emerged that foreign intelligence services had infiltrated both negotiation teams, providing each side with information designed to sabotage potential agreements. Foreign operatives posed as advisors, analysts, and technical experts, while feeding both factions intelligence that confirmed their worst suspicions about their opponents' intentions. Every gesture of compromise was interpreted as strategic deception, every concession viewed as evidence of weakness that demanded exploitation rather than reciprocation. Trent's final report described a nation that had lost the psychological capacity for self-governance, where institutional memory had been so thoroughly corrupted by propaganda and manipulation that Americans could no longer distinguish between legitimate political differences and manufactured conflicts designed to serve foreign interests. His recommendations for reconciliation were ignored by factions that preferred familiar enemies to uncertain peace. The environmental consequences of territorial division were becoming apparent as infrastructure continued deteriorating without coordinated maintenance. Nuclear facilities in disputed territories operated under emergency protocols designed for temporary crises, not permanent political isolation. Chemical plants abandoned proper disposal procedures when regulatory authorities disappeared and liability protections evaporated. Agricultural regions suffered soil degradation when environmental monitoring systems fragmented along territorial boundaries. Samuel's technical networks documented cascading failures throughout systems that required continental coordination to function safely. Power grids designed for regional integration began experiencing brownouts and blackouts as territorial authorities refused to coordinate maintenance schedules. Communication satellites lost ground control when different territories implemented incompatible security protocols. Weather monitoring systems produced incomplete data when territorial boundaries blocked information sharing necessary for accurate forecasting. The international community initially attempted to mediate American conflicts while maintaining relationships with all factions, but this neutrality became impossible as territorial authorities demanded exclusive recognition and threatened retaliation against nations that acknowledged their opponents. European allies found themselves choosing between federal coalition demands for traditional diplomatic support and state alliance threats to cut off agricultural exports. Asian partners discovered that maintaining manufacturing relationships required navigating territorial trade restrictions that changed daily based on political developments. Global supply chains dependent on American production and consumption experienced disruptions that affected every continent. Technologies developed in federal coalition territories couldn't be exported to state alliance regions due to trade restrictions implemented for national security reasons. Agricultural products from rural territories were banned from international markets when territorial authorities couldn't provide safety certifications recognized by foreign regulatory agencies. Financial systems suffered particular damage as territorial authorities implemented incompatible banking regulations and currency controls that made international commerce nearly impossible. Foreign banks couldn't maintain relationships with American institutions when those institutions operated under contradictory regulatory frameworks that changed based on political control. Investment capital fled to more stable regions, while American credit ratings collapsed due to political uncertainty that made long-term planning impossible. Military equipment scattered across factional territories created proliferation risks, as different authorities sold weapons systems to international buyers willing to pay premium prices for advanced American technology. Federal coalition forces couldn't prevent state alliance militias from selling military hardware to foreign buyers because territorial boundaries made enforcement impossible. Independent territories became arms bazaars where international criminal organizations purchased equipment that had once been reserved for American military forces. My own situation reflects the broader trajectory of this conflict toward complete breakdown of communication and hope. Federal forces have been using signals intelligence to triangulate underground broadcasters, employing techniques developed for counterinsurgency operations in foreign countries. The equipment they're using can identify transmission sources within meters, and their pattern analysis can predict broadcast schedules with remarkable accuracy. Samuel estimates we have perhaps 6 hours before federal forces locate this bunker. Our escape routes have been compromised by informants who traded our location for safe passage to federal coalition territories. The underground networks that sustained us for 4 years are being systematically dismantled as authorities offer rewards that desperate people cannot refuse. Jonathan Pike will continue these broadcasts from equipment Samuel distributed to backup locations throughout the region. Pike represents the next generation of underground broadcasters, young people who grew up during the collapse and understand instinctively that information is the last weapon available to those who refuse to surrender their humanity to political expediency. Pike's generation carries advantages my generation lacked. They never experienced national unity, so they aren't paralyzed by nostalgia for institutions that no longer exist. They grew up with decentralized communication technologies that are harder for authorities to monitor and control. Most importantly, they understand that survival requires networks based on practical cooperation rather than ideological purity. The future Pike's generation will inherit bears little resemblance to the country that existed before the territories formed. Environmental degradation from infrastructure collapse will require decades to repair, if repair remains possible. Economic systems fragmented along territorial lines will need complete reconstruction. Social trust destroyed by years of civil conflict may never fully recover. But Pike's generation also carries possibilities my generation couldn't imagine. They're building relationships across territorial boundaries based on shared humanity rather than political affiliation. They're developing technologies that bypass official communication systems controlled by factional authorities. They're creating cultural expressions that transcend territorial borders and speak to experiences that all Americans share, regardless of their political geography. Tonight, as federal forces prepare to silence this particular voice in the wilderness, I want to leave you with this thought. Nations die when their people lose the ability to see former neighbors as fellow human beings worthy of basic dignity and respect. America began dying the moment we started viewing political differences as evidence of moral corruption, rather than the natural result of diverse experiences and perspectives. But nations can also be reborn when people remember that their shared humanity transcends political boundaries and ideological differences. The America that Pike's generation builds from these ruins may look nothing like the country we lost, but it might finally become the country we always claimed to be. A place where diversity strengthens rather than divides, where differences are celebrated rather than criminalized, where unity emerges from justice rather than force. This is Elias Mercer, signing off from the underground networks that connected us when official channels failed, speaking my last words to whatever remains of our capacity for hope. Remember us not as we were when we fell apart, but as we might yet become if we remember how to listen to each other across the silence that divides us. The signal continues, the voice changes, the message endures. Until we speak again, America, until we remember how to be human together.